They all vociferously and consistently demand something right. Eventually that will happen. Therefore, parties came on board and they approved unanimously. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Just because you have a law, it doesn't mean that it gets implemented every day. There are always going to be huge impediments, bottlenecks in grassroots implementation, because you have to have the systems in place. That's why in the Administrative Reforms Commission, the first report we have released was on right to information. We gave a roadmap as to how to do it. The record keeping, making the record accessible, and management of the public records, and having an independent public records authority, these are all the key ingredients of right to information. Otherwise, you only have a right which cannot be really implemented effectively beyond a point. Unfortunately, we enacted a law in India. We're good at enacting laws. We don't do anything else that really is needed to make the law actually implementable in an effective manner. We only created the information commissions, but we haven't really created the mechanism to actually enforce the law, to implement the law, including the Public Records Office, proactive disclosures under Section 4, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more to be done, but I think all parties generally are on board. There are going to be difficulties from time to time, but we have to consistently fight and get many of the things in place, not merely the law. The law is a romantic thing, but the administrative infrastructure and the infrastructure of information that we create is actually the tedious, the boring, the dull thing. Unless the tedious, boring, dull things are in place, the romance of law is not enough to really get the results fully.
So, were there any compromises made in this enactment of law, sir?
I would not call them compromises, but they were debates. I remember vividly one issue. My colleague and valued friend Aruna Roy and others, they argued that whatever is discussed in the cabinet must be instantly made public. I opposed it very stoutly, because in our anxiety to make everything open, we may actually kill the governance process itself. Cabinet is a collection of warring tribes. If I am a member of the cabinet, I don't like the Prime Minister or Chief Minister, I am not going to say I don't like you, therefore I oppose it. I am going to invoke the people. I am going to say it's bad for the people, because there are so many issues where you have to make decisions for the long-term good of the people in the country. Sometimes in the short term they may be unpopular. Now, if the deliberations actually are made public, no government can run. That is why even in Britain and other countries, there is a rule of 30 years. The cabinet papers are released to the public only after 30 years. But today we are entitled to know what is the decision made and what are the reasons why you made that decision. These two you should let us know, unless there is a national security implication. But I cannot ask you who said what, because then the government will collapse. So I explained to them that transparency is not nakedness. We want transparency, not nakedness. Then all governance collapses and collective responsibility in a cabinet system collapses and decision making becomes paralyzed. So there are many issues. This is perhaps the most important issue. Ultimately, we all came to an agreement that the decision must be made public and the reasons for the decision must be made public, but we cannot ask for what actually transpired in the cabinet. So this kind of fine tuning, understanding the larger public interest, at the same time protecting the people's rights to know. These two must be reconciled. And I think we did a reasonably good job. This is one of the best laws in the world, I have no doubt about it.
So now there is so much of effort to thwart this law by not including some institution under its ambit. So what are your views on that, sir?
No, I think the exemptions given under Section 8 are reasonable and realistic.
Okay.
I think we should respect that. And increasingly, the case law is developing. For instance, while I wanted, for instance, personally, the political parties to be brought under the law, many of my wiser friends, they advised me not to insist on that at the stage of framing the law. Because if we insist on bringing political parties under the law, in all probability, the law would never have become a reality. But we framed it in such a manner that all public authorities, and definition of public authority is given in such a manner that eventually political parties also could come under the law. And therefore, now the Information Commission has given an order. Let us see what the courts are going to say, and case law increasingly will be developed. Otherwise, I think the way it is framed is reasonably good. Even the courts in the country were resistant. The very courts that said right to information is a fundamental right, they resisted. Wazahat Habibullah, the first Chief Information Commissioner himself, told me what happened. The Calcutta High Court argued before the Information Commission that the High Court was not constituted under the Constitution of India. Because under the law, we said any authority or organization created under the Constitution shall come under the right to information. The Calcutta High Court actually argued that they were created by the Queen's Charter during British rule and therefore they do not come under the constitution, which is a very absurd argument. But then even constitutional authorities seemingly supporting the constitutional liberties and democratic governance, they take that rule. Generally in India, we want the constitution to apply to everybody else but not to us. Everybody but me. So even the courts resisted initially. Even today they are not too happy. They are trying to invoke their own mythical privileges. This is the nature of things all over the world. We have to break through these barriers and these hurdles day by day, and eventually I am sure all the institutions will come into this. The problem is not so much whether we are covering institutions or not. The problem is we have not created the infrastructure required, the other mechanisms required to make sure that the right to information becomes actually effective and productive. The real purpose is served. And that is where a lot of work is required. And that is what I have personally focused on in the Administrative Reforms Commission in the first report. That's actually anybody who is interested in the Right to Information Act must study the ARC's first report, the second ARC's first report, which is very carefully drafted. It's a very practical roadmap as to what to do. We actually brought out that report within 2 years of the law, because under the law, there is a provision by which the difficulties can be overcome without going back to legislature. Unfortunately, the government did not utilize that provision. We lost that. Now we have to amend the law where necessary. But there are still many executive things we can do. For instance, in the law, we have committed a small error. We did not really create any authority which actually owns the law and makes sure that the law is implemented. And a very powerful and high prestigious body like the Information Commission was only meant for appeals, which was really an omission. I can't even explain why that omission took place. It was an error on my part, I concede. We should have made the Information Commission the authority to actually monitor the implementation of the law. Even now, by executive authority, governments can give that commission that power. But the law did not really give that power, which is a mistake. So all these are sought to be overcome in the ARC report. If only the government acted on that quickly, it would have been useful. Even now, we can do a lot to make the law much more effective.
So what did Lok Satta do to advance this cause of RTI after its enactment?
Actually, we came out with, I must compliment the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative before the law is enacted for doing a remarkable job of identifying all the sources of information in the world and giving a history of this law and comparing the various enactments in the world and giving us a sense of what could be done. Now, post enactment of the law, Lok Satta was a pioneer in creating a module for training in the state and across the country. In particular, we took the ownership in Andhra Pradesh. We worked with government agencies like Center for Good Governance, and we brought civil society groups across the state together, and we first inspired them, then educated them, then created training modules and took up on a very big scale across the state. They were all largely developed by us, and later they were happily adopted by the government agencies, and they took up the programs. Government has the advantage of scale and resources, but the government has the disadvantage of lack of passion. Government don't act with passion, they act bureaucratically. But government is doing it, and many civil society agencies are now involved. Lok Satta movement too is involved, but there are many more involved now subsequent to this, because this must become everybody's effort, which is a good thing. And I'm happy that some good work is done in the country. It doesn't mean that everything is now in good shape. Because right to information is a law which will be progressively implemented, breaking through the resistance, building case law and creating infrastructure and instruments. And B, there are other things required like service delivery, for instance. Most of the applications for information, they are not really about information, they are about grievance redressal. So unless there is also grievance redressal mechanism tied up with Right to Information Act and the mechanism to enforce this law, it will not give full fruits. That's why we are now working on the grievance redressal law and on the service delivery law, which is to my mind much more important than Right to Information law. So many other things also must come into place.
So unfortunately, many RTI activists have been injured and even attacked. Some are even attacked or killed, sir. So how does that make you feel, sir?
In fact, obviously, we are all saddened and angered both. At one level, that also shows the power of such law, that the vested interests are so threatened that they resorted to extreme violence, in some cases even killing shows. If only the constitutional instruments are properly utilized, how you can check abuse of authority and corruption effectively. So that actually gives me hope, if only we use the instruments very effectively. But it also makes me, like everybody else in the country, very angry that we don't have instruments in the country yet to protect the rule of law. We may have right to information, but there's no rule of law yet. And in some cases, even the governmental agencies are complicit. They're colluding with the corrupt people and the mafias in harassing or sometimes even hurting individuals. So unless many more things are in place, rule of law, unless we create a framework in which no citizen who is fighting for what is right can ever be hurt or attacked, unless that becomes institutionalized in the country, that becomes part of our culture, our work is not over. Right to information is just one important step, a significant step forward. It's necessary but not sufficient. A lot more is required to protect citizens and to ensure that Indian governance is safe. It actually works for the people of the country, not for the marauders who are now temporarily in positions of office. Ultimately, all this is part of a larger effort to reclaim the republic that has been stolen from us. Indian Republic has now become captive in the hands of a few functionaries of government, political or bureaucratic. We have to make it the people's republic, and right to information law is one such instrument to make it the people's republic, but there are many more things to be done.
So your other dream, Citizen Services Guarantee Act, is slowly becoming a reality. Will combined with RTI, will it have a greater impact on
Absolutely, absolutely. As I said, most of the applications for information are essentially about grievance redressal. That I could not get this certificate, or I could not get water connection, or this road is not being built, or there is corruption in the building of the road or a building or something. RTI took care of some of those things. For instance, many people did not use it. RTI actually said the sample collected in the execution of a work is information. Most people don't realize it. I don't think many people really use that. If you actually have doubts about the quality of the road built or a building built or a bridge built, you have a right to collect a sample legally and then get it tested subsequently. So that's the reason why RTI Act has been very careful in defining information. But I don't think we really have understood how to utilize it fully. And once service guarantee is there in place, then people are much more empowered along with the right to information. Once service is an entitlement, and non-delivery of service entails a penalty on the part of the employee and a reparation, a compensation to the citizen. And if millions of people habitually get services in their municipalities, in their panchayats, in their localities routinely, then much more will happen. So that's a much more powerful instrument, and together with RTI, that will really make people understand. Even today, for most ordinary people, right to information is a conceptual thing. It's an esoteric thing. It is not a real thing to affect their lives on a day-to-day basis. But what happens in a government office is a real thing. The harassment, the humiliation, the delay, the corruption, everybody. There's not one citizen who does not feel it, does not face it, including me. On some context or other, each of us is a victim of that. So we immediately realize it and we want it. Therefore, together they become a very powerful combination. We must view them together, and I'm sure very soon we're going to get the service guarantee law. And again, to implement that effectively, it requires a lot of back-end process engineering. It merely because you have a law, things don't improve. The law gives an enabling framework. It gives an entitlement. But to make the entitlement real, a lot of institutional re-engineering is required. And I hope that also will happen in the next few years. And India will be that much better off.
And finally, looking back, do you think RTI has delivered on its promise? Is there something which can be done to improve the things?
Up to a point. If you study the first report of the Administrative Reforms Commission, released I think in 2006, and if you implement those recommendations, they are very practical, robust, very mature recommendations, pragmatic recommendations. They are not revolutionary, they are not out of the world, they are very, very eminently achievable, and they also gave a roadmap. If you implement each of those recommendations, then RTI will be much more effective. And along with Service Delivery Act, and along with rule of law in the policing and justice administration, once these three things are in place, and the fourth element is decentralization of power. If power actually devolves on the local governments with accountability as much as possible, once those instruments are in place, then you will see much more impact. Now, RTI has a synergistic impact on things. It's like information technology. On its own, it cannot do anything. Along with other things, it has a tremendous impact. One of the reasons why some people are disappointed is they don't realize RTI in itself does not deliver anything except information. But coupled with actual delivery of services, actual rule of law instruments and accountability instruments and empowering instruments at the local level, RTI has a phenomenal impact. So RTI is going to grow in its importance and its power, its efficacy over time. We should not be discouraged about short-term difficulties, but we must get the other things done so that 2 plus 2 is not 4, it is 22. There is synergy. And that's what happens when you have a service delivery law, when you have local government empowerment, when you have accountability instruments, and when you have rule of law. All these things together will have profound impact on the lives of citizens and our democracy and its trajectory.